So I am a journalist and editor. I've been working in sports media for about 20 years now, and I currently work for Sky Sports on the digital side of the business. So we are the Europe's biggest commercial digital publisher, and obviously we run a network of broadcast channels as well. And we're part of a bigger organisation called Sky that has a presence across Europe, and we're part of the Comcast group. So that's kind of what I do. So my focus is editorial. So I work with all our teams to help them produce their content and promote live sport on Sky, but also tell stories and different levels of the game. And my focus really for the last few years has been around LGBT people in sport. That's where I've focused a lot of my own personal journalism in that space. I would say it's improved slowly, but I think back to when I was starting out in my career, back in the 2000s, and there was very little, like hardly anybody who worked in my industry who was LGBT and out. These kind of things weren't even spoken about in workplaces. There wasn't really much understanding about the community then, and this was before we had legislation and all the visible signs of progress that we've had in recent years, such as equal marriage, greater LGBTQ rights in the UK. So that was kind of understandable. And then really, I think in the last 5 or 6 years, it has actually, become a lot more visible, I think, in the industry. That's partly, I hope, by the fact that our network group, which I might come on to talk about in a little bit, formed, and that has been, a visible presence within the sports media industry here in the UK. At the same time, of course, we've had more visibility in sport as a whole. So LGBTQ athletes sharing their stories, feeling able to, to show their authentic selves on social media, be more open, I think, with the general public. So these things have come in, but it has taken a long time, and it's only really in the last few years of my working in the industry that I've really felt that representation grow. There probably hasn't been that LGBTQ visibility at very senior levels of sports media editorial and in the industry. And that, I think, hasn't necessarily been sort of, these people in the senior roles. I think it helps, to have that LGBT representation at that level, because then it lets the whole organization know that people can be their authentic selves in the workplace. They can, they don't have to hide who they are just to fit in. So obviously we want to see more of that coming into the media space, but also, we want people who coming into the industry, so the younger generation, to feel like they can be themselves from the very beginning of their careers, and have that confidence to want to be able to tell stories relating to LGBTQ people in sport, but also, to be those kind of visible role models in their organizations. I think one of the problems that we've had, and what we're still having now, is that people go to university, they go to college, they're able to kind of be away from home in many instances for the first time, and be more open about who they are. But then they go into their first jobs, and then they kind of go back into the closet. They're not quite sure often, particularly in an arena like sports, whether or not that they can be out and find that acceptance within the workplace. So, what we're trying to do is help them and, give them the confidence to be themselves, I think, but also, just to let people know that our industry is changing. I think there's a perception and an expectation that it is still an industry in which, there are problems with homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, all of those forms of discrimination. We know that exists, but largely what we found as, a large network group of LGBT professionals working in this space, a lot of those perceptions aren't actually reality for most of us working in our industry. So we're trying to change the perception as well, but that's going to take some time. On the question of athletes specifically, we have had that level of visibility, I think, in terms of sexual orientation. Certainly in certain sports, that's really, really growing. Over here, there's been a big explosion in women's soccer. We're seeing the Women's Super League, which is the top flight league in this country, that's really grown in its visibility and interest in that sport. So there's a lot of lesbian and bi representation within that league, very, very visible. And then I think in other sports, it's been perhaps a bit more limited. There are like major sports over here, like cricket and rugby. They do have that level of representation, but perhaps those sports are slightly more conservative in some respects, and the visibility there, isn't quite at the same scale as women's soccer. And then the question you raised about gender identity, it's very limited levels of trans and non-binary and intersex athletes who are visible on a public level in these sports, or even more widely. But what we are finding is that at an amateur level, we are finding stories of those athletes, largely really positive stories, where they've been accepted by their teammates, or they found welcoming sports environments in which they're able to play the sports they love and be themselves, which is obviously really, really pleasing. There has definitely been some backlash against trans athletes, particularly trans women athletes, of course. And that has grown because there has been, I think the issues around trans inclusion have really sort of come to the fore in recent years. And there's been a pushback from certain groups against, trans women being in women's spaces, and sport would definitely come into that. I think quite often these stories and those views have been perhaps blown out of proportion in the media. So often you see these kind of stories being reported about why inclusion of women athletes, trans women athletes, is problematic. But actually, when we look at the general public mood, we look at survey results and we gauge kind of what people's views are on trans inclusion. We see a lot of support for trans rights, but people, do find that the whole issues of sport very confusing. There's a lot of information out there. Some of it can be misleading, and a lot of policies that are still evolving in different sports. So we are seeing kind of increasing kind of misconceptions, misunderstandings about what it means to be a trans athlete in sports. So I think the role that the media can play is being having a much wider view of this topic, making sure that we're including trans and non-binary people in our reporting, making sure we talk to them, understand the challenges that they face, and also showing those stories of acceptance where they are. And this is largely the case that we find, is that they're able to find places to play sport at an amateur level, because there are very few professional athletes who are trans, and they're able to play their sports and be accepted. So that's really encouraging. I did add it a little bit in the beginning. I started out, came out of university where I'd done sports, I'd done a journalism degree, moved into football journalism. And, I was trying to find my feet in the industry. I was working in a very male-dominated workplace. And really, there weren't any kind of understanding or conversations at that time around things like equality, diversity, inclusion. In the 2000s, these topics, weren't discussed, and we saw much more examples of sexism, misogyny, microaggressions, all those cultural workplace culture problems that mean that working in an office space sometimes can be really, really difficult, can make you lose your confidence. And that was something that affected me. I didn't feel able to be myself in the workplace. I was hiding who I was. There were some incidents of homophobia, kind of not intentional, people not really understanding what it meant to be gay and why that might be difficult for somebody. So that kind of made me stay in the closet. And really, it wasn't until I kind of reached my early 30s, as society, I suppose, was beginning to be more understanding about what it means to be LGBT, that I was able to kind of, find my confidence levels again and feel more able to talk about, who I was, where it was relevant, and be out in the workplace. And that was obviously, hugely beneficial to me. And actually, ever since then, my career has really kind of, I've had a lot more success. I was kind of able to move down to London, take the job I'm in now. I don't think any of those things would have happened when my confidence was really, really low. And then knowing the effect that had on me, and being able to be part of LGBT network groups at my company and in the media industry, I really wanted to create something for sports media specifically, because we were an industry where there was no really very little LGBT visibility or representation. And social media was, a fantastic tool then to find other people who are similar to myself, other people working in sports journalism who happen to be LGBT as well. So we came together, we had conversations, there was enthusiasm to create a network group, and we did that and launched it in November 2017. And since then, it's really grown. There's been a lot more people who've come to us. We've probably got a core group of about 30 to 40 people, but what we've also done is really helped to build a community that's much bigger than that and goes, to all different parts of sport and media. So, we've been able to grow fairly sizable social media followings, but also community spaces, which have about 400 to 500 people, part of those groups, and then events that we put on, physical events, obviously before the pandemic, and they've been virtual events over the course of the last year or so. That's been really great in order to kind of grow recognition around the group. And we've done a lot of partnerships and collaborations with other organizations too. So yeah, it's been really great to see the network grow. I think, we're like, as an industry, LGBT inclusion is still kind of being understood, and how it relates to an athlete's performance. So one thing we like to talk about a lot is authenticity. And I think there's been a kind of a growing understanding now that, if you're an athlete, if you happen to be LGBT, but you can't sort of talk to anyone else about that, you feel like that's something you have to hide, that's obviously going to impact on your performance in a major way. And through that, I think there's also been understanding, like, if you happen to be a journalist or an editor, then, if you're experiencing something similar, then again, it would impact on your performance. You wouldn't be able to kind of produce your best work. So I think what we're doing as a group is we're able to go to organizations that are much bigger than ours. For example, the Sports Journalists Association, which is the major kind of industry association over here in the UK, which has, hundreds of members, really well-known organization. We've been able to take our learnings into there and, make sure that we're represented at a committee level. And it's just really helped that now that when people do have issues relating to either the reporting of LGBT people in sport, or they have issues in the workplace, they come to us, they have conversations, they get advice. We're able to put them in touch with people that can help them and offer mentoring and kind of build up those kind of relationships. So I think our industry is really beginning to understand that, we are a place that has LGBT people in it. And if they do have any kind of questions related to that, then we're the ones that can really help them. With Stonewall, who you mentioned, obviously they are the leading LGBT charity here in the UK. They have a great deal of respect and influence. They've always been very supportive of our group, and we were able to work with them on lots of projects. For example, I work on a campaign here called Rainbow Laces, which you may have heard of, and that promotes allyship and inclusion across sport. And the work that we do to support that campaign at Sky Sports means that I'm able to have regular conversations with Stonewall. And what we're seeing now is that a lot of these other LGBT charities, for example, an organization here called Mermaids, are also trying to find how they can get involved in sport as well, particularly for young people who may be questioning their gender identity. So these other charities are now realizing that sport is such a great way to bring community together and be able to kind of help people deal with these challenges of being LGBT. And so we're advising them, we're working with loads of different organizations so that we can bring that message of sport is for everybody to these charities as well. I'd say is that again, speaking from a media perspective, is the main word I would use is empathy. I think largely we have a very supportive population who largely they will know LGBT people in their own lives. They'll have friends and family, but there's often a misunderstanding around why would I need to know if an athlete, a footballer, a rugby player, a cricket player, whatever the sport is, why would I need to know that they're LGBT? Why would they ever need to mention that in an interview or on social media? a lot of people think, well, I just want to watch sport, I just want to enjoy the game, and I'm not really interested about what they would say is people's personal lives. I think what we're helping to grow the understanding around is that being LGBT is not just about, for example, who you go to bed with, who you have a relationship with. It can also play a big part on your confidence levels, on how you interact with other people, your mental health, because as a community, there are lots of different factors that impact us. For example, when people use language and behavior, often unintentionally, that makes us feel unwelcome or unsafe in sports spaces. That can be a major factor. And just trying to navigate, like trying to separate our professional public facing lives, which athletes obviously are very well-known public figures, from our personal lives. And that can be more complicated, of course, when you're LGBT. So I think we're trying to grow that understanding and empathy, just inviting people to read our stories, to understand more about how these different factors impact us as people. That is helping to grow inclusion. That's making people more aware about why an athlete, for example, might need to, or might be keen to talk about this part of who they are.